Hi guys, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. So what I'm looking at here is a HEMA focused training sword, arming sword, essentially for sparring, from Fabri Armorum, aka Jiri Krondak. And I've previously shown a shorter version of one of these that they've been working on, and I made some feedback on that, and this is the result. And I've got to say, so far in dry handling, I haven't used it for training yet, I'm really impressed. I have experience of other HEMA arming swords, and there's some really good ones out there and there's some less good ones out there. My most exposure I've had is actually to the Peter Regnier ones, which I like, but there are certain things that I would personally change about them. But this actually has some of the features that I would change on it. So first up, let's have a look at what we've got here. So it is an arming sword, that is a one-handed medieval sword. It's in a kind of generic, basic hilt style. There we go. It's got a straight crossguard and a wheel pommel. It could fit in the 11th century right the way through to, I suppose, typically the 14th century and just about into the 15th century. It's a pretty generic arming sword of a type, certainly the hilt type that was around for a long time. In terms of the blade, we couldn't really give it an oak-shot typology as such, because of course it's a blunt blade that's been made specifically for HEMA fencing and HEMA training. So it has a fuller in the base of the blade down here to maybe add a bit of stiffness and reduce a bit of weight, and it's relatively flat. Now, very often one of the problems with flexible training swords is that they end up being overly flexible in the wrong portions of the blade, but you'll see that when I flex this, it does indeed flex where you would want it and doesn't flex where you'd want it. So generally speaking, we want sword blades to be, certainly training sword blades, and very often real sword blades as well, to be stiff in the first half of the blade and then only flex in the second half, or some people prefer only the last third of the blade. What I would say about blades that flex only in the last third is it puts an awful lot of strain on a very small bit of steel. So generally speaking, I do understand why people want a blade to be as stiff as possible for as much of the blade as possible, because it's better for practicing technique essentially. It feels more like a real blade, which is generally stiffer than a practice blade. But from a safety point of view, having the flex distributed more evenly over the second half of the blade is certainly, I would say, safer, because you're putting less stress on, you're spreading the stress over a larger area of the blade. In terms of the blade profile, what I was going to say is one of the problems is often if a blade doesn't have a lot of distal taper, what you end up with is when you bend it, it bends in the middle of the blade. And certainly some reenactment swords are made like this, and they feel horrible. Whenever you bind or clash with another sword, bind against it or wind, or just when you defend, or even when you hit, you get horrible vibrations in the blade, and the whole blade kind of wibbles, and it feels like you're fencing with kind of like a wet fish. It just feels horrible. Not that I've ever fenced with a wet fish, but it is horrible. However, blades that are stiff, at least for the first half of the blade, or first 2/3 of the blade, feel much nicer to use. They parry solidly, they bind against other blades more stiffly, and you get more feedback in the hand, and you can actually feel where the blade's going, and it keeps going in the right direction. When you hit things, they don't go blah, blah, blah in the middle. They tend to hit a little bit more solidly. But they still have that thrusting safety. And I have to say, because this blade is slightly tapered, it has achieved that without having to have really aggressive distal taper. So one of the points I've made in previous videos is that very often pointy swords, like this Albion here, don't need that much distal taper, because they've actually got what I would call silhouette taper. So they're how they appear like this, they've got lots of taper this way, so they don't need lots of taper in the flat portion of the blade. Blades like that, which are broad, do need lots more distal taper, otherwise they end up being too heavy at the tip and they feel horrible. So this sword has a good flex. Related to the flex is the tip. Now the tip's quite unusual. I'll try and bring it as close as I can to the... There we go. So rather than being a solid rolled tip, what it is the flat of the blade actually comes up to a flat end, and then an extra plate is welded rather than brazed in this case. I know that Jiri Krondak likes to braze a lot of things. This actually looks, maybe it is brazed actually. Yeah, no, I think it is brazed. And the plate has been rolled around the end, solid metal plate. So it's a bit like when we put metal tips, cartridge tips we used, spent cartridges, on the end of a darkwood rapier blade. A darkwood rapier blade is just like this, it's just sawn off flat at the end. And we put a metal tip over the end because they're much safer than the rubber tips. The rubber tips have a tendency to split sometimes, and when they do, the square end of the blade can injure people, as I have seen on more than 2 occasions. So that would be 3. But so yeah, so this is essentially like that solution, but it's brazed on, so it's kind of permanently fitted. So the only question for me would be durability. How does that stand up? Does it break off? Does it, you know, how does it survive use? And I don't know that yet because I haven't used this type of tip in anger yet. But on the surface of it, it seems certainly, I mean, I can push that with force into the palm of my hand, and I'm not just being hardcore, it just doesn't hurt. Okay, so that's good. In terms of the sword as a whole, it moves great. I was actually talking to Jiri before he sent this, and he was a bit concerned that the point of balance was too far from the hilt, and that he wanted it to be closer to the hilt. And I said, well, how far out is it? And he said, well, it's about, I think about, what is that, about 5 inches. And I said, well, that sounds fine to me, that sounds like a real sword. What I don't want, and I have to say, some of the, I haven't looked at the latest ones, but some of the Peter Regnier blades are balanced very close to the hand. Now I do understand the reason for this. It's because it reduces the amount of impact at the blade end, so it means that they're a little bit kinder to your training partners or opponents, and they don't hit quite as hard as blades with point of balance further out. However, they don't feel so much like a real sword in the hand, and I have to say, this has a point of balance of very, very typical for an arming sword, for a genuine medieval arming sword, either a good replica or an original antique. And as a result, it feels like a medieval arming sword. It's great. It moves exactly how it should do. It moves really, really nicely, and I wouldn't change that point of balance at all. To me, in the hand, this, I have to say, is one of the best, certainly in dry handling, and I haven't used it, as I say, I haven't used it for sparring yet, but in dry handling, this is one of the best arming sword, HEMA sparring armour swords, HEMA sparring arming sword, that's quite a tongue twister, that I've ever handled. It really moves nicely, and if we just grab something like a buckler, which would often be used with this, you can get really nice little fine movements in there. You can control the tip really well, and it just really tracks really, really nicely. It just feels like a real sword, and it has a fair amount of authority and presence in the tip. Now, my only concern, and obviously I don't know this yet because I haven't used it for sparring, is that it might hit quite hard. That's my only concern. But we'll see. It's certainly not going to hit any harder than a reenactment sword because it's lighter and better balanced than most of those, and it has some flex in the blade. Certainly the thrust is going to be safe. My only concern is how hard the edge hits, essentially. But there we go, a first impressions review of the Fabri Armorum 33-inch blade. This is, I forgot to mention, 33-inch blade HEMA sparring arming sword. And I'm really impressed with it so far. One final thing to mention actually is Fabri Armorum has this way of attaching the pommels where the tang, don't know if you can see in this light, but the tang is actually brazed into the pommel. It's not, it does go most of the way into the pommel, but then it's solidly brazed in, and it's not, it doesn't come out the end and isn't peened. As I said to Jiri, one of my concerns with that is in use, the guard is going to get loose because the wood of the grip will compress with vibrations and just general usage, and the guard will get loose, and you've got no way of tightening it up without taking the whole grip off and mounting a new tighter grip on. Because normally with a peened tang, you can just ding the thing with a hammer and it will sandwich, it will squish that sandwich down and vice it all together. But you can't do that when the pommel is essentially welded onto the tang. So that would be, in an ideal world, I would want the tang to go all the way through to the end and be peened at the end like a traditional tang. Maybe that's something we can all encourage Fabri Armorum to start doing, because I mean they could physically do it, it's not difficult, and in fact it's simpler than the method they're currently using. But in terms of how this sword handles and what it looks like and its weight and length and how it moves and everything else, I'm really liking this. And you know what, I've already verified with them that they could put any hilt on this blade. So the first thing when I looked at this blade I thought, that would look nice on a basket hilt. And they do make basket hilts, so you could put this blade on a Highland basket hilt or a Skivona or a side sword hilt. This would work with finger rings and maybe a knuckle bow and a slightly shorter grip maybe. This would work fantastically, I think, as a side sword simulator. A side sword which is essentially an arming sword but just with a slightly more protective hilt, developed hilt. So yeah, so I'm really impressed so far, but I need to use it. I need to test its durability and also test how hard it hits. Cheers guys! Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and feel free to follow us on Facebook.